What was supposed to be a celebration of multilateralism at the G7 summit turned into a dramatic confrontation between Canadian unity and American unpredictability. Trump didn't arrive as an ally. He arrived like a wrecking ball, armed with tariffs, ultimatums, and ego too large to fit in any diplomatic room. His demand, total submission to his economic worldview. But what he found instead was a country and a prime minister prepared to push back. Mark Carney, standing at the summit podium, didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out. He simply pivoted. Gone was the G7 traditional communique, scrapped, tossed in the bin. Why? Because Carney knew one signature from Trump would taint every page. Instead, Canada delivered clean, single-issue statements, focused, factual, and beyond the reach of Trump's veto power.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
It was a subtle diplomatic coup. Carney didn't play Trump's game. He flipped the board. The auto tariff bombshell that blew up Trump's credibility. Trump's 25% tariff threat on foreign-made automobiles wasn't just economic. It was psychological warfare. It struck at the heart of Canadian manufacturing, threatening tens of thousands of jobs in Ontario and across the auto corridor. But Trump's calculation was shallow. He thought Canadians would panic, that they'd fold. Instead, factories began retooling. Workers rallied. Provinces coordinated emergency export strategies. Ontario's premier and Alberta's government, once political adversaries, formed a rare alliance to protect interprovincial supply chains. Canada didn't flinch. It adapted. And in the background, Mark Carney picked up the phone, not to Trump, but to Europe, to Japan, to South Korea. Let's talk autos, he said. While Trump tweeted threats, Carney built trade. Canadians hit the streets and the stores. But perhaps the loudest response didn't come from Parliament Hill or summit press rooms. It came from the streets. From Vancouver to Halifax, over 2,000 peaceful protests erupted in one weekend. They weren't anti-American. They were pro-Canadian. Signs read, "Not for sale, keep your tariffs," and "Buy Canadian." Local businesses saw surges in support. Canadian farmers, manufacturers, and small producers were flooded with online orders and retail traffic. It wasn't nationalism. It was economic solidarity. Grocery chains launched 100% Canadian campaigns. Lumber yards offered discounts on Canadian wood. The backlash to Trump's tactics wasn't just diplomatic, it was retail. Economic patriotism, once a slogan, became a national movement. The Trump show falls apart on the global stage. While Canada rallied, Trump unraveled. International media observed the G7 like a political drama, and it became clear Trump wasn't leading the summit. He was isolating himself from it. Other leaders, France's Macron, Germany's Scholz, even Italy's Meloni, gravitated toward Carney, not because he was loud, but because he was logical. Trump arrived with chaos. Carney answered with coherence. While Trump huffed about deficits and trade betrayal, Carney spoke calmly about cooperation, diversification, and market resilience. At one point, cameras caught Trump alone at a breakfast roundtable, leafing through papers while other leaders gathered elsewhere. It was symbolic. The man who once dominated international summits now sat sidelined, outmaneuvered by a country he thought he could bully into silence. A country's values put to the test. Canada's resistance wasn't just about trade. It was about identity. Trump's rhetoric, framed in blunt nationalism, exclusion, and economic blackmail, ran directly counter to Canadian values, inclusion, equity, and rule-based trade. And Canadians noticed. Trump mocked climate commitments. Carney reinforced them. Trump threatened to walk away from trade pacts. Carney invited new partners in. Trump labeled allies as enemies. Carney called for shared prosperity. This contrast became unavoidable, and for many Canadians, it triggered an awakening. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about what kind of country Canada wanted to be, and who it could count on. A backfire scene from Beijing to Berlin. Trump believed his aggressive stance would isolate Canada. Instead, it isolated him. In Brussels, the European Commission signaled stronger economic alignment with Canada. In Tokyo, Japanese diplomats praised Canada's composure. In New Delhi, Indian officials accelerated agricultural trade negotiations with Ottawa. And in Beijing, ironically, China floated increased LNG imports from Canada, bypassing a U.S. they now viewed as an unreliable partner. Trump's plan had been to trap Canada between Washington and Beijing. Instead, Carney walked Canada right to the middle, past the wreckage, toward a multipolar future. Economic self-reliance gets a boost. Internally, Canada used a trade conflict to light a fire under its own innovation agenda. Tax credits were expanded for clean energy tech. A national fund to scale up Canadian EV battery production was accelerated. Provinces received grants to develop copper processing infrastructure. Yes, copper, the same material Trump had just slapped with a 50% tariff. It wasn't just about fighting back. It was about moving forward. Carney's message to Canadians was clear. We will not be held hostage. We will invest in ourselves. No communique, no concession. Trump's frustration peaked when he realized the summit would end without the traditional G7 statement. He called it an insult. But what really infuriated him was this. No one cared. The other G7 leaders had already signed onto Carney's segmented statements on climate, trade transparency, AI, and human rights. Trump's veto power was irrelevant. The world had moved on without him. And Canada was at the center of that new momentum. Carney's leadership style, silent strength wins wars. Trump thought loud threats equaled strength. But Carney proved that steady, principled leadership could achieve more in whispers than Trump could shout from a podium. Behind closed doors, Carney engaged in 17 bilateral meetings in 2 days. No photo ops, no leaks, just deals. Investment pledges from Germany, trade facilitation from South Korea, copper contracts from Chile, infrastructure alignment with the EU. Trump mocked globalism. Carney practiced globalism. And it worked. This wasn't just a skirmish. This was a fracture. Canadians, once reflexively deferential to their neighbor, saw clearly what it meant to stand up for themselves and win. The trust that once defined the Canada-U.S. relationship had been tested. And while the door isn't shut, it's no longer wide open either. Carney has made clear Canada will deal with the U.S., but only on equal terms, with mutual respect. Not under threat. Not under fear. Mark Carney didn't campaign for glory. He didn't hold rallies or insult leaders on Twitter. But by the end of the summit, even foreign diplomats were calling him the anchor of the G7. He had no slogans, no flags waving behind him, just results. A coalition held together, a summit salvaged, a country respected. In a world increasingly dominated by noise, Carney's signal cut through. The G7 summit didn't welcome Trump. It warned him. Canada's outrage was real, coordinated, and effective. The protests weren't just a rejection of policy. They were a rejection of posturing, aggression, and economic warfare as a tool of diplomacy. Trump tried to fracture the G7. Instead, he unified it against him. And Canada? It emerged not as a victim, but as a leader, a resilient, principled, and globally respected force. Trump underestimated Canada. Now he knows better. By the summit's close, it wasn't just diplomats paying attention. CEOs, analysts, and investors around the world had turned their eyes north. The Canadian dollar stabilized despite tariff shocks. Commodity prices, especially for aluminum and timber, began fluctuating, not from Canadian instability, but from uncertainty in U.S. policy direction. The markets were sending a signal. Trust is capital. And America, under Trump, was burning through it. Meanwhile, Canada, under Carney's quiet stewardship, was building something deeper. Economic credibility. Investors like certainty. They like mature leadership. They like partners who sign deals, not tear them up in front of cameras. And on that stage, Canada didn't just look calm, it looked competent. Trump's auto gambit collides with reality. The 25% auto tariff wasn't just bad politics. It was economic sabotage. North American auto manufacturing is deeply integrated. Cars assembled in Ontario contain parts that cross the border 5, 6, even 7 times before completion. A tariff on that system isn't a penalty. It's a bomb dropped on an ecosystem. American automakers panicked. Ford, GM, Tesla, they all issued quiet statements. Supply chains would be disrupted. Prices would rise. U.S. workers would be laid off. And for what? Trump wanted a headline. But in the background, Detroit CEOs were calling Ottawa, not Washington, looking for alternatives. Carney's team opened the door. Canadian auto ministers convened emergency talks with unions and manufacturers, offering incentives for new plants, battery facilities, and cross-border transport hubs. If America wants to self-sabotage, one union rep said, we'll keep the lights on up here. Carney redefines Canadian power. The days of polite Canada playing second fiddle were over. Carney, without flash or bravado, was now commanding a new image. Canada as a grown-up in the room, not through military muscle, not through economic dominance, but through reliability, respect, and rules. In every G7 breakout session, from climate to AI, from clean tech to trade, Carney delivered specifics, targets, funding, timelines. Trump offered grievance and threats. Carney offered governance. This mattered. Japan signed a semiconductor partnership with Ottawa during the summit. France pledged to expand Canada-EU digital cooperation. Even India's delegation issued a rare endorsement of Canada's trade posture. Domestic politics rewritten by foreign policy. Back home, Carney's approval rating surged. Not because he gave fiery speeches or promised handouts, but because Canadians saw him stand up for the country on the world stage without blinking. He didn't insult Trump. He didn't fold. He stayed the course. Opposition parties, caught off guard by the public's united mood, backed Carney's trade stance. Conservatives, Greens, New Democrats, they all endorsed the Canada First, not Canada Alone resolution passed in Parliament. It was a declaration that Canada wouldn't retreat, but it wouldn't escalate either. It would lead. Trump's G7 meltdown goes viral. On American cable news, the clips went viral. Trump alone at a dinner table. Trump scowling through a climate panel. Trump exiting early, skipping the final press conference. The message was unmistakable. The G7 had carried on without him. Fox News called a snub. MSNBC called an implosion. But the real takeaway? Even America's allies had stopped waiting for Washington to lead. Carney, asked later if he felt snubbing the U.S. was risky, replied with measured pause. We're not here to isolate anyone, but we will not be isolated ourselves. It was the quote of the summit. Behind the scenes, how Canada held the line. In the weeks leading up to the G7, Carney's team had worked like clockwork. Dozens of back-channel meetings with France, Germany, Japan. A strategy to neutralize Trump's veto power. A document-sharing system that bypassed the traditional communique bottleneck. And at the core of it all, discipline. No leaks. No anonymous barbs. Just readiness. Every time Trump moved the goalposts, Canada didn't chase. It waited. And then, strategically, it made its next move. Carney wasn't playing to win Twitter. He was playing to win outcomes. This isn't just about lumber or autos or copper. It's about what kind of world the next generation inherits. Trump's vision is transactional, nationalistic, driven by headlines and hostility. Carney's vision? Cooperative, multilateral, grounded in climate goals, tech standards, and shared prosperity. These aren't just abstract differences. They shape policy. They shape people's lives. Will countries share green tech or hoard it? Will digital standards promote equity or surveillance? Will climate targets be collective or fractured? In this context, tariffs aren't just taxes. They're ideological weapons. And Canada, under Carney, has chosen its side. For Canadians, the past months have been revealing. They've seen their neighbor turn belligerent. They've seen global systems bend under populist pressure. But they've also seen what unity, strategy, and humility can achieve. And in that realization, a new national character is emerging, not afraid to be firm, not afraid to lead, and no longer content to play backup in a system that rewards noise over sense. Canadians, once stereotyped as passive and quiet, just pulled off one of the most disciplined foreign policy responses of the decade. The summit ended. The press flew home. The papers ran their stories. But one thing lingered. Canada didn't just respond to Trump. It warned the world. It warned that old alliances can fracture if abused, that bullying has limits, that even the most polite nations have boundaries. And most of all, that leadership isn't volume, it's vision. The summit's final image wasn't Trump waving from Air Force One. It was Mark Carney standing beside Macron and Scholz, arms crossed, smiling, in front of a banner that read, resilience, cooperation, sovereignty. 3 words that weren't just themes of the summit, but a warning shot across the bow of anyone who thinks they can use threats to dictate global policy. Something changed during this G7. It wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about dignity, about the kind of nation Canada chooses to be when confronted with economic aggression and ideological hostility from a supposed ally. Trump's tantrums didn't just provoke retaliation. They provoked reflection. Canadians weren't merely defending supply chains. They were defending the soul of their country. And the message was delivered with unmistakable clarity. Canada will not be coerced. Not by threats. Not by tariffs. Not by tweets typed in anger. At 3 a.m., Canada doesn't flinch when pushed. It thinks. It plans. It adapts. And then it acts. Carney's multilateral move. The summit within the summit. While Trump played the spoiler, Carney played the strategist. Behind the scenes, he organized what diplomats quietly referred to as the summit within the summit, a working group between Canada, the EU, Japan, and the UK to build what they called a resilient supply bloc. Not a trade bloc in the traditional sense, but a strategic network to bypass volatility, to prioritize trust, to coordinate standards on EVs, critical minerals, rare earths, and AI governance, sectors where Trump's America had become too erratic to rely on. The goal was simple: create a buffer against unilateralism. And the subtext? If the U.S. wanted to isolate itself, fine. The rest of the world would move forward without them. The rise of the Democratic Trade Corridor. Carney's vision went beyond diplomacy. It had infrastructure behind it. A key deliverable from the summit was the Democratic Trade Corridor Initiative, a multinational framework that would connect trusted partners through dedicated shipping lanes, secure data sharing, and aligned environmental standards. Canada was no longer just exporting goods. It was exporting reliability. This corridor, Carney said, isn't about walls or tariffs. It's about bridges. The contrast with Trump couldn't be sharper. One leader was building pressure. The other was building passageways. Trump's erratic legacy faces a formal rebuke. By the summit's final day, Carney made the boldest move of all, a formal resolution, backed by every other G7 member, declaring that trade coercion between allies was a threat to global stability. It didn't name Trump. It didn't have to. Diplomatic language is often dull by design. But this wasn't dull. It was diplomatic thunder. And in G7 history, it was unprecedented. A country united, not against America, but for itself. For all the noise around Trump, this wasn't anti-Americanism. It was pro-Canada. The difference matters. Canadians weren't burning flags. They were waving their own. In grocery stores, on car lots, in the streets. They were choosing their nation. Buy Canadian wasn't a slogan. It was a signal to the world and to Washington. That signal said, we are not a junior partner. We are not a pawn. We are a sovereign, serious, modern nation, and we expect to be treated like one. The shadow alliance rises. Even as Trump retreated from global agreements, Carney was busy forging new ones. Canada signed a digital currency memorandum with the EU, a new AI ethics charter with Japan, and a joint investment framework on green steel with Germany. These weren't flashy, but they were future-proof. They showed that Canada doesn't need to shout to lead. It leads by example. And while Trump's press team was spinning another tariff threat as decisive leadership, the rest of the G7 quietly signed on to Carney's trade integrity declaration, one by one, in full view, without apology. The final turning point: trust, not size, defines power. The United States remains the world's largest economy. But what the summit proved, painfully, publicly, and permanently, is that economic size means little without economic trust. And Trump, through arrogance and aggression, shattered that trust. Meanwhile, Carney was reinforcing it. Every speech, every handshake, every sideline agreement. Allies noticed, investors noticed, and more importantly, Canadians noticed. It wasn't about Carney being flashy or charismatic. It was about him being competent. And in this era, that was radical. The economic standoff, that wasn't. Perhaps the most stunning part of the G7 wasn't the drama, but what didn't happen. Canada never imposed retaliatory tariffs, never stormed out, never leaked hostile talking points. Instead, it did something far more powerful. It held the line. That line was drawn in quiet dignity, in clear-eyed diplomacy, in the calm refusal to be provoked. And it worked, because days after the summit ended, U.S. automakers were already pushing the White House to reverse course. Governors from border states called for constructive re-engagement, and even some Republican senators admitted that the tariffs were ill-advised. Canada didn't have to fight. It just had to outlast. The long game belongs to the strategists. Trump plays a minute. Carney plays a decade. And in the game of geopolitics, that's the only game that matters. While Trump was measuring applause lines, Carney was measuring economic output, trust indicators, and investment flows. While Trump picked fights with the media, Carney was meeting with mayors and governors. While Trump tweeted, Carney built. Canada's G7 summit wasn't retaliation. It was a realignment, a redefinition, a refusal to be pushed back into a subordinate role. And when history looks back, it won't see a tantrum. It'll see a turning point, a warning, not a welcome. The summit should have been a celebration of allied strength, but it became something else, a polite but powerful intervention, a warning that trust has limits, that alliances have expectations, and that if pushed far enough, even the quietest nations roar. The final statement wasn't read with fanfare. There was no parade, no dramatic exits, just a line buried near the end. The integrity of trade relations between partners is essential to the global order. Coercion in any form will be met with coordinated resilience. That wasn't just policy. It was a doctrine. There's no going back. Not to the days of automatic trust. Not to the assumption that the U.S. will always lead wisely. Canada has stepped into a new role, not out of ambition, but necessity. It now leads not just as a middle power, but as a moral power. And that power isn't measured in megatons or market share. It's measured in how a nation holds a line when pushed. Mark Carney, in a private off-record remark to aides, said it best. You don't win against a bully by becoming one. You win by refusing to flinch and letting the world see that courage is contagious. The G7 saw it. The world saw it. And now the world knows. Canada isn't playing backup anymore. It's rewriting the script. One handshake, one principle, one summit at a time.